All right. Well, let's get this ball rolling because I always want to make sure I get as much time as I can to get this stuff and have a lot prepared for you. So for tonight, if you don't have your handout from last week, you want to make sure you grab one from back there. So you want to make sure you have that. So you just finish that. The handout that I gave you last week, and then part three is the new one tonight. Just make sure you have part two and part three. They're back there on that music stand towards the back door. You know. So we are going to pick up in chapter 7. So you're going to turn in your handouts until you find the title at the top that says Daniel 7, the Four Beasts. All right, so just a quick little recap, catching us up to where we are. Last week, we talked about the dream that Nebuchadnezzar had in Daniel chapter 2, and shared some of the differences between that and what we're going to be looking at tonight in Daniel chapter 7. There's some similarities, there's some differences. We talked about how those two chapters are linked in a certain way. So I don't have time to get through all of that again, but if you want to re-listen to that, the YouTube videos are available. I'll give a quick note. If anyone has tried to watch YouTube videos, did you get seasick?
Yes.
There was a setting on the computer over here that was like an auto follow, and every time I moved my hand, it was following my. And so you will get seasick if you try to watch last week's video. So just listen to it if it needs to. That setting has been turned off, so hopefully you won't get seasick with this video if you need to watch it. Of course, somebody else to watch it.
My bad.
But they are available, so you can go back and check it out. Okay, so Daniel chapter 7. This is the first of the visions that Daniel has. It's recorded throughout the rest of the book. So we've talked about this, chapters 1 through 6 were full of tales, right? Stories of what was going on with Daniel and his time in Babylon, his interactions with the different kings and all that kind of stuff. So those were all tales. Then we get to chapter 7, and this is where we see a major shift in the books. We talked a lot about this last week, about how it shifts from tales to apocalyptic literature. And I'm sure you've noticed this if you've ever read the book of Daniel. We have this really crazy shift that happens here. Just everything sounds different, everything feels different. And again, in previous weeks, we talked about all the reasons behind it and what we're looking at here with all of it. Chapter 7 serves as a little bit of an hinge to the two books of the book. So it connects back to the first part of the book, as we talked about the connections of the next chapter 2, mostly in counting through the four kingdoms. We'll introduce that way this chapter. And it also connects back to language. We talked about last week that the tales are in the second half of the book is in Hebrew, but chapter 7 is actually still written in Aramaic. Even though it's connected to the second half of the book. So you can obviously see that the writing of this chapter is intended to connect with those tales and just kind of bringing the five books together as one. But as we go through this, we're going to see again that familiar theme that we already went through in Daniel 2 with the four kingdoms. But we're also going to introduce something new here, something that's going to be the major theme, really, that runs through chapter 7 and the vision in chapter 8. Lord willing, we might get to that tonight. We'll see how far we get along here. And that is the little horn. Okay, so there's going to be this image that comes up in both of these chapters, in both of these visions. That's the little horn. So you're going to see that this is going to become the predominant image, the focal point, if you will, or these next two things at least, the focal point other than God, right? And what God's going to do. Climax of both of these chapters, the main point of both of these chapters and these visions is that in the end, God wins, right? That's like the main point. God's in control and God will take care of me. But if you're just talking about the situation of what's going on in the world, this little horn figure becomes the most important thing we're going to talk about. So before we get into all of that, though, let's just go ahead and we'll just go through the story that we find, the vision that we read in chapter 7. And that's what we'll cover here for the first couple of pages. So It begins by Daniel having a vision of four beasts that come out of the sea. All right, Daniel has a vision of four beasts that come out of the sea. So I'm going to read that to you, verses 2 through 8. Because I, Daniel, saw in my vision by night the four winds of heaven stirring up the great sea, and four great beasts came up out of the sea, different from one another. The first was like a lion and had eagle's wings. Then, as I watched, its wings were plucked off, and it was lifted up from the ground and made to stand on 2 feet like a human being. And a human mind was given to it. Another beast appeared, a second one, that looked like a bear. It was raised up on one side, had 3 tufts in its mouth among its teeth, and was told, "Arise, devour many bodies." After this, as I watched, another appeared, like a leopard. The beast had 4 wings of a bird on its back and 4 heads, and dominion was given to it. After this, I saw in the visions by night 4th beast, terrifying and dreadful and exceedingly strong. It had great iron teeth and was devouring, breaking in pieces, and stamping what was left with its feet. It was different from all the beasts that had preceded it, and it had 10 horns. I was considering when another horn appeared, a little one. There's that little horn that I mentioned. A little one coming up among them to make room for it. 3 of their horns plucked up. There were eyes like human eyes in this horn and a mouth speaking arrogantly. All right, so that was the vision that Daniel saw, as recorded here, of these 4 beasts coming up out of the sea. And then he has this vision of a judgment day. All right, so we're switching settings here, and he envisions now judgment coming upon these beasts, if you will. So as we read on in verses 9 through 14, it says, "As I watched, thrones were set in place, and an ancient one took his throne. His clothing was white as snow, and the hair of his head was like pure wool. His throne was fiery flames, and its wheels were burning fire. A stream of fire issued and flowed out from his presence. 1,000 thousands served him, and 10,000s times 10,000 stood attending him. The court sat in judgment, and the books were opened. I watched then because of the noise of the arrogant words that the horn, talking about the little horn, was speaking. And as I watched, the beast was put to death, and its body destroyed and given over to be burned with fire. As for the rest of the beasts, their dominion was taken away, but their lives were prolonged for a season at a time. As I watched in the night visions, I saw one like a human being, or other translations, a literal translation, actually, one like a son of man, coming with the clouds of heaven. And he came to the Ancient One, and was presented before him. To him was given dominion, and glory, and kingship, that all peoples, nations, and languages should serve him. His dominion is an everlasting dominion that shall not pass away, and his kingship is one that shall never be destroyed. All right, so that's the entirety of the vision. You have 4 beasts coming up out of the sea, and the little horn kind of is grown on that last beast, and that seems to be very concerning. And a lot of attention is given to that 4th beast and that little horn that comes up. And then he envisions a judgment day, right? The ancient one, God, sitting in judgment against these beasts, and specifically against that little, and judgment is passed. And then we have this figure that appears on a cloud that looks like a son of man, is how it's described, and that all dominion and everything was given to this figure. And that's the end of the vision. Okay? So, Daniel at this point is looking for an interpretation. So, a heavenly being shows up and gives him this interpretation. So, here's the interpretation that's offered. Starting in verse 17, it says, "As for these 4 great beasts, 4 kings, or kingdoms, that can be translated either way, shall arise out of the earth. But the holy ones of the Most High shall receive the kingdom and possess the kingdom forever, forever and ever." Right. And much to Daniel's dismay, that's all he gets for an interpretation. It's like, really? That was a big, long vision. That's all you got for me? So thankfully, Daniel inquires a little bit more. And it goes like this, starting in verse 9. It says, Then I desired to know the truth concerning the fourth beast, because that was most concerning, most terrifying. Took up the bulk of the description. Visuals. It says, because this one was different from all the rest, exceedingly terrifying with its teeth of iron and claws of bronze, and which devoured, broke in pieces, and stamped what was left with its feet. And concerning the 10 horns that were on its head, and concerning the other horn, the little one, right, which came up, and to make room for which 3 of them fell out. The horn that had eyes and a mouth, it spoke arrogant, and that seemed greater than the others. As I looked, this horn made war with the holy ones, and was prevailing over them until the ancient one came. Then judgment was given for the holy ones of the Most High, and the time arrived when the holy ones gained possession of the kingdom. So, and then the interpretation. So that's what Daniel wants to know more about, right? So then the interpretation is given in more full, and this last part of the interpretation, which is the bulk of the interpretation, is focuses specifically on that fourth beast, and specifically even more than that, the little horn that came and did the things, right? So as for the fourth beast, starting at verse 23, there shall be a fourth kingdom on earth that shall be different from all the other kingdoms. It shall devour the whole earth and trample it down and break it to pieces. As for the 10 horns, out of the kingdom 10 kings shall arise, and another shall arise after them. This one shall be different from the former ones, and shall put down 3 kings. He shall speak words against the Most High, shall wear out the holy ones of the Most High, and shall attempt to change the sacred seasons and the law. And they shall be given into his power for a time, 2 times, and half a time. Then the court shall sit in judgment, and his dominion shall be taken away, to be consumed and totally destroyed. The kingship and dominion and the greatness of the kingdoms under the whole heaven shall be given to the people of the holy ones of the Most High. Their kingdom shall be an everlasting kingdom, and all dominions shall serve and obey them. All right. So before we get into dissecting this whole vision and interpretation and kind of pulling it apart piece by piece, just some important notes here, some things that are just important to get our minds in the right place here. So, talked a lot about this last week. Just because there are similarities between Nebuchadnezzar's statue and the kingdoms that are represented in that statue and Daniel's 4 beasts. But it's important to remember, as I talked about in the last class, that these stories are told for different reasons and in a different style of literature. So we talked last week about how Daniel 2, Nebuchadnezzar's dream, that was a biblical story, right? Because what happened at the end of the story, there is the whole thing about God's kingdom will last forever, but then the end of the story is when Daniel is lavished upon by Nebuchadnezzar because he knew the interpretation and all that kind of stuff. But you can see that this one focuses on basically the judgment against that whole horn, against that final beast, and that God's kingdom will come. And that's the end of the story, right? So that's the focus of this one. It's a political statement about what's going to happen. It's a statement about taking care of business and all that kind of stuff. So that's the purpose of why this one is told. So the vision in Daniel 7 likely used the 4 kingdom progression, utilizing Daniel 2 to complete that kind of about it last week, to link the tales of 2 to 6 with the visions of 7 to 12. And the story ends with God's kingdom being established forever, and the earthly kingdom is being completely destroyed, as opposed to how Daniel 2 ended. So we talked about this last week, how the kings and the kingdoms in Daniel 7 are completely irredeemable. So that was a theme that we saw earlier in those first 6 tales, that whether it be Nebuchadnezzar or whoever, King Darius or whatever, at some point in that story, they're usually like, oh yeah, your God is cool, and there's some kind of redeeming nature about those kings. but not in this. You're going to notice that throughout these visions, there's no redeeming of these Gentile kings, right? Of these pagan kings or these earthly kings. They are evil and judgment needs to come against them. So that's the tone that's set here. Daniel 7 also addressed the plight of the Jewish people. So it talks endlessly about how, especially this little horn, right? What he did and trying to, he terrorized the people of the Holy Ones and trying to hurt them and all this kind of stuff. And it goes on to that. So it's the situation that's being written to is very different. It's very desperate. And there is, throughout all of these visions, there is that desperate feeling about it, where, damage is being done really, really bad. So another important point is the four beasts. Notice where they came from. They came up out of the sea. An important thing to remember is that in the ancient world, the sea was understood to be a place of evil and chaos. So it's just the ancient Near East mindset. The sea equaled chaos. So they were coming out of a place of evil, out of a place of chaos. And there's a whole lot of teaching I can get into about how one of God's rules in creation specifically is to take a world that's in chaos and bring order to it. And that's just part of Yahweh and what he does. So what we're just basically seeing that these kingdoms come from a place of chaos to go come from a place of God or stability. Yes. Could be the sea of politics. Politics is pretty chaos. Yeah, the politics and chaos may be hand in hand.
Actually means nations.
Sea means nations.
You say sea, if you look in Daniel, all four of the beasts, and they say they come from the sea, well, they're actually coming from nations, not the actual sea.
Well, look me up afterwards. I'd be curious to see the resource that you got. But
Yes.
yeah, actually you mentioned that. It's nice. So, well, actually, with just a little bit of a fun note, I can't steal Josh's thunder here. But if you look, just as your homework, I always got it assigned as homework, right? And it's not making watching the video that makes you sick. It's read. Read about these beasts, okay? And then jump to Revelation 13 and read about the beast that's talked about there. And look for similarities. And just hang on to that. Because Revelation utilizes the imagery here of Daniel in a pretty neat way to get its message across later on. So just check those two out side by side, see if you notice some similarities. Yeah, real quick, more. Oh, on the handout, it's New Revised Standard Version is the one I have here. Yeah. You're welcome. Great question. So, yeah, she was wondering about Bible translation and New Revised Standard Version. So, all right. So, that was just some important notes before we get into it. So let's break this down. Let's look at the vision and let's look at the interpretation and see what we can pull from. Okay, so as I have done it in previous handouts, I just kind of had, previous handout I had side by side, or I guess it's this handout previous. So I have the vision on one side and the interpretation on the other, just to help compare those two side by side. This might make it easier to see. So the first thing you may notice here is that those first three beasts, right? The first, second, and third beasts, as they're described in the vision, I guess that's a fairly decent description of them. Not terribly short, but it doesn't give a whole lot of details. But the interpretation spends almost no time, right? The interpretation just says, as for these, and it actually says four great beasts. Four kingdoms shall arise out of you. That's all it says. Okay? Now, you may notice, I guess not. Now you may notice the difference in the vision. Where do they come from? The sea, right? And in the interpretation, it says they came out of. So the theme that you see throughout these, and it connects with the ancient Near East mindset, is that The vision is basically seeing things in the spiritual realm, is the concept behind that. It's seeing the spiritual heavenly realm of things. All right? Whereas the interpretation is kind of giving an earthly connection to that. What is significant is in the ancient Near East, the mindset was everything that happens in this world is merely a shadow or a reflection of things that are happening in the heavenly realms. Like that's the idea behind it. So basically, so when you're reading the vision, you're kind of getting the supernatural side. And then when you're reading the interpretation, you're getting the earthly side. So the supernatural side says they came from the sea, that place of evil and chaos. But in reality, they're just nations rising out of the earth, right? That's the reality that's actually happening. And so that points about the things that we read about vision have an earthly counterpart or an earthly reflection or shadow, whatever word you want to use, they all are. It's going to become very important a little bit later on in this vision. So just hang on to that a little bit. You actually see that concept described in the book of Hebrews. In the book of Hebrews, it's going through and talking about the tabernacle. Okay? And it mentions that the earthly tabernacle was merely a shadow of the heavenly one, right? Jesus came and the book of Hebrews talks about how the priests, when they did their thing or whatever, they were just merely doing it as a shadow, like, right? They're going through the shadow of the heavenly temple, the heavenly tabernacle. But Jesus, when he came and did his business as the high priest, right? He operated in the real tabernacle, right? In the real presence of God. So that's just an example of that kind of thinking, if you will. But that's what we're going to see here. So that's a very, very important concept to remember. Sorry, it's very dry. Okay, so after this, then he sees the vision of the fourth beast. Okay, and the angels, or the interpreter, the angel, the heavenly beings, quick thing does say, four great beasts, four kings are arising out of the earth. But then he has more to say about this fourth beast. Okay, this is what he says. From the fourth beast there shall be a fourth kingdom on earth that shall be different from all the other kingdoms. So that fourth one we're going to focus, right? That one's going to be different. Something special about this. It's not the same as the others. It shall devour the whole earth and trample it down, break it to pieces. And as for the 10 horns, out of this kingdom, 10 kings shall rise. So I looked it out. And then he gets into the little 10 horns, and then there's a little horn, same beast. And we're going to learn that these horns represent kings. Okay? And that it spends a lot of time speaking about that little horn. So just looking at this chart, like even without reading it, you just get the visual of it. You can see what the important part is, right? It's down here. It's that fourth kingdom in that little horn, because all the interpretive time is spent there, right? The previous part is just kind of like getting into this so we can talk about it, right? And you're going to see that similar thing in chapter 8, even a little more predominantly, right? We're going to get some earlier stuff out of the way so really we can get to that little horn and talk about that horn, because that's the important part. That's the thing that really needs to be discussed. Right? That's the crux of the issue. We flip around. Um, then we have the description of the Ancient One. The Ancient One shows up and sits in judgment. And you may notice this is the only part of the vision that doesn't have an interpretation. Why? Well, first of all, this needs some interpretation. We know what's going on here. But this is the cool part, because the actions of God Himself have no earthly count, right? God is acting, and this is what He's doing, right? So there's not like some earthly counterpart that needs interpretation to it. The ancient one is not representative of some earthly thing. Like each of the beasts are representative of kingdoms. The little horn is representative of a king, and all this kind of stuff. The ancient one's the ancient one, right? So need no interpretation there. And then we have the judgment scene. And the interpretation just kind of quickly reminds us that uh, the dominion will be taken away from that little horn. And then we get to the Son of Man part, or depending on your translation, some translations it's one like a human being, one like a son of man. And then it says that everything's going to be given to him. So I'm going to get into the details of all that. I just wanted you to see that chart really quick, so you can kind of see the comparison between the two. Okay, so let's break down this interpretation. So the first part there, oh yeah, apocalyptic literature usually works on an assumption of physical earth in the shadow of reflection. What's happening with everything else? I already explained it. You know I have that written somewhere. So the first three beasts, as I mentioned, very little attention is given to them. They're not of much concern to the original recipients. We're just kind of getting through them to get to. All right, so then we get to the fourth beast. And the fourth beast, like the fourth kingdom in Nebuchadnezzar's dream, is given the most attention. Remember that from last week in chapter 2, when you get to that fourth part, that iron part, and the iron plate mixed below it. That's given the bulk of the attention, right? And the descriptions that we see back in chapter 2 are very similar to the descriptions that we see here. Terrifying, dreadful, exceedingly strong. We even have a callback, I think, even says it had iron teeth. You remember that part of the statue was the iron part of the statue, right? So this beast has iron teeth, devouring, breaking in pieces, stamping. And it says specifically here that it's different from the other beasts. Probably, and so the nation that we're talking about here from last week, that's Greece, the kingdom of Macedonia, of Greece, and it's different. So why is it different, right? So it's different for a few reasons. First of all, this is the only one of these kingdoms that doesn't have an Asian or a Middle Eastern or a Near Eastern origin, right? This comes from Europe, right? It came from the complete opposite direction, right? So these are Europeans and people from Greece. So it came from the west as opposed to coming from the east. It's also different because it's going to be divided. And chapter 8 is going to spend more time talking about that division. We get to that next. So it's going to be a divided kingdom. So it's different in a lot of ways. And also just the way that it's devoured and stamped. We talked about that in the past couple of weeks, how Alexander the Great, that first king, the incredible march that he had, that in about a decade's time, he completely conquered the known world. Like it was insane what he was able to do. So it was terrifying. It was dreadful. It was exceedingly strong. And what was done stamped everything out. So, but then we get to the little horn, and this is what receives the most attention right here. Okay, so this little horn is assuredly talking about Antiochus. Okay, because it gets very detailed here as far as what it's going to do, and it lines up, and it is especially even more detailed in chapter 8. So hopefully we'll get to that. I think we'll get to that tonight. And you're going to see that in chapter 8 very, very specifically gets to the point of what's happening. So let's describe the descriptions that are given to them. It plucks up the three previous ones. And if you remember, Antiochus kind of came to power under suspicion about bringing kings in front of him. It spoke arrogantly. Remember, he talked about how he took the name Epiphanes, which means the manifest one, or God manifest. Seemed greater than the others. This is the impact that he had on Judaism. Week 1, we talked in great depth about all the things that he did and all the things that happened. And this is where it gets a little more specific. It says that it made war with the holy ones and was prevailing over them. So Antiochus 167 BC destroys Jerusalem, kills many Jewish people, desecrates the temple, and just lays flattens all the people fleeing for their lives. And what happened in that moment was really bad. This is an interpretation that he shall attempt to change the sacred seasons and the law. It's exactly what Antiochus did, right? He outlawed he outlawed practicing it. He changed. He was changing the seasons. He was making it illegal to practice the festivals and the law, all that kind of stuff. So, yes, Brad.
Sorry, I didn't mean to derail you.
Oh no, it's all right. Go ahead.
So, I've been wondering about this for the last couple hours. So much. I'm not understanding is calling it a little horn, but yet it has to pluck out 3 horns for space to fit.
Mhm.
He's got 10 eyes, a mouth. It seems like it would be a big horn.
Mhm.
Any insight on that?
Yeah, there's some thoughts about that one, right? Oh, I'm sorry. His question was, if it's such a dangerous horn, a little horn, why is it little? It's actually a really good question. Because, in the next chapter, when we get to chapter 8, um, a horn is ascribed to Alexander the Great, and it's called a huge horn, right? That guy was a big horn, right? He was very powerful in what he did. So there's a lot of, guesses as to why it is that. But what makes the most sense to me is ultimately, this horn is destroyed by God, right? So it's probably putting a little bit in its place, just perspective of what it is in comparison to God. It also is possibly likely that by the time Antiochus IV came to power, the Seleucid kingdom was in a lot of trouble, right? It wasn't as powerful as it once was, and it was really on some of its last legs, and the end was fairly near. So he can, and at the same time, I think it plays well with the whole idea that um, he aspired to be God. He set himself up as God. He spoke arrogantly. It almost has that picture of that little kid with a big mouth, that's a little too big for his own britches kind of thing. So I don't know. I think it could be a combination of those things, but it never specifically explains why it ascribes little to this horn. But I think those are the best ideas out there. Probably the image that it's trying to draw. So, but yeah, great question. Yes, Jerry.
My research, I had thought the kingdom of the leopard was up because the quickness of his invasions.
Mhm.
And also comes up next chapter, the one with I, I think the kingdom of the leopard represents itself and not really.
He was just thinking he understands the interpretation of the leopard meaning uh, uh, the Greece instead of Persia. So yes, that is also a different interpretation out there. So let's try to, if you guys have legitimate questions, that's fine. If you have comments for me, just to keep this moving along, you're welcome to talk with me afterwards. So yes, Shannon, go ahead. I have questions from yes.
About the first three or after the 3.5 years? After Israel is defeated and deceived, and then the temple is built, the third temple will be built in desecration. So is that just when you're talking about?
She's asking what temple I'm referring to. So yes, that's what the temple that's destroyed by Antiochus with temple on earth. So that's the question. Yes. So yeah, it's Solomon built a temple, right? Destroyed by the Babylonians. Then they were in exile for a time. They returned from exile, the Jewish people under Zerubbabel. They began rebuilding the temple. The prophets Haggai and Zechariah encouraged them to resume that, and the temple was rebuilt. That's the temple I'm referring to. So, and that really was the only other temple. So it's all from that period when that temple was rebuilt until the Romans destroyed it in AD 70, so after the time of Jesus. That's known as the Second Temple period, Second Temple period. Now, Antiochus did a lot of damage to it. The Maccabees rebuilt it. That. Herod, when he came along, remember Herod the Great had a huge building project. He renovated, made it big and beautiful again, right? The great big beautiful temple. And so it was renovated somewhat again. So that second temple was damaged and renovated and destroyed and rebuilt, and so it was through a lot. But that's that second temple, and this is the destruction of Antiochus, 160s BC, 167 BC. So thank you for that question.
Part where it talks about the fourth beast will be given power over time, 2 times.
I'll talk about that. Yep. He just asked about the beast having the power for a time, 2 times. I will get to that. All right. So The little horn, yeah, just I was talking about the things that the little horn fused of. And that's the very next bullet point. When Jerry Sasquatch said, they, meaning the Jews, will be given into its power, into his power, for a time, 2 times, in half a time. So that is probably what we're referring to a period of 3.5 years, right? A time, 1 year, 2 times, 3 years now, and a half, 3.5. So what's this referring to? Um, Two things are being alluded to with this. Number one, the period between Antiochus destroying that temple in 167 BC and the Maccabean revolt, Jews Maccabees regaining control of that temple and rededicating it in 164, that's over 3 years. So that's the time period it's referring to. But it was actually 3 years and 10 days. We actually have exact days for this, right? So it was actually just over 3 years. But 3.5 is also half of what? Math scholars? 7. It's half of 7, right? 7 being the perfect number, the number of fullness. So you're going to see that number begin to come up throughout this book. So that 7, that is the fullness of the time for which God will bring his judgment. So it's the idea that for half of that perfect time, that imperfect half is when there's the struggle. But when the fullness comes, God's going to move. So there's some literal significance to that number, which that's dangerous because never in apocalyptic take anything. Right? Everything is symbolic. Everything, the beasts are symbolic of something. The one that looks like the Son of Man. We'll talk about that. That's symbolic of something. Everything is symbolic of something in these visions. And an interesting tendency that a lot of people, when looking at these visions, is they understand that beasts and horns, all these things are symbolic, but they love to make the numbers literal. Like nothing else is literal. Why are the numbers being made literal? So they should not be taken literally by any stretch of the imagination. But that 3.5, half of 7, that perfect, there's a very theological, spiritual significance to that. So we have the judgment scene. So it had been part of Jewish eschatological hopes from the day of the Lord, that the day of the Lord would arrive, and God would establish an eternal kingdom through the Jewish people. So this judgment scene gives hope to the original recipients that God is still in charge, right? He's stronger than the little horn, and his promises will come to pass. So the judgment scene is a heavenly scene. It's something greater than the things that are going on in earth, right? And then we get to the best part of this vision, okay? The one that's described as one like man. All right, this is the part of this vision, and possibly the part of the book of Daniel that excluding Daniel the Lion's Den that's told in every children's church, right? But excluding those parts of Daniel, we're talking about just the vision. This scene right here, where this one like a son of man shows up, I'd say is by far the most read or the most referred to of all this part of the book of Daniel, right? And the main reason for that is because Jesus refers to this, right? This connects to Jesus. So this part gets me so excited. I love what Jesus does with this passage and what he has to say to you on it. So because you're familiar with that term, even if you were never aware that term, Son of Man, comes up in Daniel, you know it's in the Gospels, right? We've heard that before, right? As a matter of fact, that's Jesus's preferred way of referring to himself, right? Other people would call him other things, like we'll talk about this a little more when we get to chapter 9 about like Messiah, right? That term, but you may notice Jesus never calls himself Messiah, right? And if anyone ever identifies him with that, it's usually when he pulls out the whole, okay, don't, right? Because there were wrong conceptions about Messiah. We'll get into more of that. But Son of Man, that's his preferred term and way of referring to it. So why? What's he doing here? And not only that, not only does Jesus use this term to speak about himself, but he does directly quote this, or I should say directly refer to this, in what's known as the Olivet Discourse. So in the 3 synoptic gospels, Matthew, Mark, and Luke, they're called synoptics, because they have synopsis with one another that have similarities. We have Jesus making this statement. So I'll read the 3 to you. One from Matthew, So that's what Jesus says. He says, then the sign of the Son of Man will appear in heaven, and then all the tribes of the earth will mourn, and they will see the Son of Man coming on clouds of heaven with power and great glory. So that's the part that connects to Daniel, right? And so he's referring to the Son of Man coming. Mark 13 says, then they will see the Son of Man coming in clouds of great power and glory. And Luke says, then they will see the Son of Man coming in clouds and great glory. All right, so what's Daniel trying to say here? Or excuse me, what's Jesus trying to say here with the Son of Man figure in Daniel? What's the connection that he's trying to draw? Okay. So remember, this is the part where this becomes really key and becomes so cool with what Jesus. So I love this so much. Remember that in these visions and how apocalyptic literature works and how the ancient Near East mindset was that everything that's happening in the heavenly realm has an earthly counterpart, right? Okay. So we have learned in the interpretation what the beasts are, right? The beasts represent earthly kingdoms. That is given to us plainly in the vision, right? The little horn represents one of those kings that comes from the fourth kingdom. Okay? So we got all 10 horns or 10 kings. We got all these connections, right? So and then there was no connection. There was no return to the whole ancient days. If you remember, right? There's no earthly side of that. But there is actually an earthly side of the Son of Man one. All right, so the Son of Man term. It's interesting because this is not the only time this is used in the Old Testament, and it's actually a common term that you see in the ancient Near East. And it's a term that was very commonly used to refer to heavenly beings or angels. You can think of it that way. So the original recipients, in Old Testament times, of this, they would have understood when this Son of Man figure was being described, how they would have understood it originally, is that some angel or some heavenly figure showed up, right, at this judgment scene, and dominion was given to it. Just as a side note, it's this return of the Son of Man on the clouds in churches and whatever is often talked about as some beautiful, glorious moment of Christ's return. Let's notice here this is connected with judgment. Right? When the Son of Man shows up on a cloud, judgment comes with it. This is really a day. That's what it is. So just remember that. So when Jesus is saying about that, kind of for himself, he's like, it won't be a happy day. And as you read down through the rest of all of this word, you see that as a day of judgment. But that's just kind of a side note. All right, so the original readers would have seen, okay, so that's a heavenly figure that's coming. Okay, and then when they read in that vision, and what Daniel said in saw in the vision, was that all dominion and all things were given to him. When the interpreter, the heavenly being that's interpreting this, when he gets to that part, okay, this is what it says in verse 27. Listen to this. It says, the kingship and dominion and the greatness of the kingdoms under the whole heaven shall be given to the people of the holy ones of the Most High. Their kingdom shall be an everlasting kingdom, and all dominion shall serve and obey them. Okay, that's the same language that's used about the Son of Man in the vision, right? So in the vision, it's all dominion and all things for all time is given to a son of one that looks like a Son of Man. In the interpretation, all dominion and all things are given to the people of the holy ones. All right, so they would have seen that heavenly angel being that they describe as one that looks like a Son of Man, as what was representative of them, God's people. Okay, because it was given dominion, they were given, and that goes perfectly in line with all the Old Testament eschatology, right? All the prophetic talks about the end times, that God's people would be set up as a light to the world, and everyone would come to them, and they all look to them, and also this perfectly lines up with that concept. So this is not an initial concept. This is normally what was thought about in Jewish eschatology at that time, right? But Jesus does something so cool. He says that image, that we have of this heavenly being that's representative of you back in this vision. I'm going to identify with that vision. And I want you to think of me the way you thought about that. So what's Jesus saying when he makes that connection? He's saying, I'm a heavenly being who's also your representative, right? You're co-heirs with me. We read all about this in the New Testament, right? This is New Testament language, right? Jesus comes and he'll be associated with judgment and all that kind of stuff in future time, but he's heavenly and human at the same time, right? He's that bridge that crosses that line. So that's why that Son of Man title was so important to him, and why Messiah wasn't. Again, we'll talk more about this. I'll just say a little bit. But by the time you get to Jesus' time, that Messiah term was overly politicized, right? People were feeling there was a Messiah that would show up that would politically free them from Romans instead of their political nation. Jesus kind of stayed away from that because it's like, I'm not a political savior, right? I'm not someone that's just showing up to set up some nation free or to overthrow nations. That's not why I'm here, right? But I'm here as the bridge between heaven and earth, right? And he's both. He is both God and man. And so his identification with this image in Daniel is really powerful. And I love what Jesus is doing right there. So I don't know, is that cool to anybody else? I think that's cool. That's why that term is so important for Jesus, what he's trying to accomplish. He's taking how the people understood that. How it's originally meant to be understood. He's like, let's think about that through the lens of me and what that means for me. So, yes, I'm good. Judas got Paul. Yeah, I thought Judas got Paul. Absolutely. So,
Are you referring to Matthew 24:30?
yeah, 24:30. Yep.
Really?
So I don't have to get into all that, right? I
It's great.
well, let's talk afterwards if you want to. So,
I'll cover the other.
yeah, Josh is going to actually cover that in a lot more detail in the Revelation.
He identified it. So I don't know where you're getting, he never said he was the Messiah.
Okay. But he also wanted to keep it. Jerry was just pointing out that Jesus identified as the Messiah, but he also kept that quiet. Like you could tell, he wasn't a fan of it, right? And not once did he ever call himself Messiah. So he acknowledged.
Living God. And you said yes.
Yeah, he said, yeah, Peter said, are you the son of the living? Jerry, if you have legit questions, it's fine. Let's not get into back and forth. Okay, let me teach what I'm here to teach and we can chat later. Okay? Sorry. All right, so the Jewish people, just to close up chapter 7. So the Jewish people during the time of Antiochus IV Epiphanes were greatly suffering. But the author of the visions in the book of Daniel had a message as well. As great as Antiochus IV seemed, God is the day is coming when God will judge the nations for their evil, and his eternal kingdom will be established. The dominion given to the people of God was eventually, the dominion given to the people of God was representative in the heavenly realm by a figure referred to as someone like a son of man. Jesus will eventually utilize that image to explain his purpose and ministry. He has come to become one with humanity, come on the clouds, day of judgment, and inherit eternal dominion over the earth. The people of God, due to Jesus becoming one of us, co-heirs with Jesus. All right, let's switch over to part 3 and get into chapter 8. All right, so my little paragraph I have at the top there gives a quick recap of chapter 7. I don't need to go over that because we just went through chapter 7. So the second paragraph of my introduction here. In chapter 8, the little horn will return. Return of the Lord, part 2. So the reader already knows that the little horn is a problem and will be subject to God's judgment. But now the details of his wickedness will be made plain and discussed more thoroughly. The vision in chapter 8 also functions as an interpretive key to the rest of the visions of Daniel, as it is the only one that links specific kingdoms, Media, Persia, and Greece, to the images presented. If there was any confusion surrounding which kings or kingdoms Nebuchadnezzar's statue or Daniel's four beasts were referring to in chapters 2 and 7, this vision helps to clear that up. So one thing you'll notice as the visions continue on, in 7, 8, 9, and then 10, 11, and 12 are all one put together. So there's four visions that Daniel has, even though 6 chapters with 4 visions. You're going to see that kind of with each one, we have a tighter focus. All right. The one we just did in chapter 7 is a little more of a broad stroke, right? We've got 4 kingdoms, 4 beasts. It does focus in a bit on that 4th kingdom and the little horn, right? But it's some broad strokes. And then there's 4 kingdoms, there's the little horn, there's Judgment Day. It's big, right? It's a pretty big picture, okay? Chapter 8 is going to tighten that focus a little bit, right? It's not going to get to the whole 4 kingdoms again. It's going to talk a little bit about 4 kingdoms, only just one kingdom before the Greeks come along, but it's going to focus much more heavily on the little horn, and it's going to be much more descriptive, much more detailed about what happens with this little horn, right? And then when we get to chapter 9, we're going to get to a tighter focus. And chapter 10, 11, and 12, specifically 11 and 11, you're going to see it's the most descriptive, the most detailed as far as just events that occur. And it takes it one step further and brings in the concept of the resurrection of the dead, which is very fascinating because that's the only place in the Old Testament we actually read about the resurrection. So we'll be getting to that. So just notice that all these visions build on each other, but they all narrow the focus, narrow the focus, narrow the focus. Big picture to focusing in on what's important. All right, so the first 2 verses give us the setting of the vision. Okay? Daniel starts by saying, in the 3rd year of the reign of King Belshazzar, the vision appeared to me, Daniel, after the one that had appeared to me at first. And referring back to the last vision, so we have a connection there. All right. In the vision, I was looking and saw myself in Susa, the capital, in the province of Judah, and I was by the river Lava. All right. And Daniel visions a ram. Okay, so here's where the vision really begins. We have the symbols showing the vision. It says, I looked up and I saw a ram standing beside the river. It had 2 horns. Both horns were long, but one was longer than the other, and the longer one came up second or after it. I saw the ram charging westward and northward and southward. All beasts were powerless to withstand it, and no one could rescue from its power. It did as it pleased and became strong. Now Daniel then envisions a male goat. Right? So he says, as I was watching, a male goat appeared from the west, right? From the other direction, from the west, coming across the face of the whole earth without touching the ground. The goat had a horn between its eyes. It came toward the ram with the 2 horns that I had seen standing beside the river, and it ran out of savage force. I saw it approaching the ram. It was enraged against it and struck the ram, breaking its 2 horns. The ram did not have power to withstand it. It threw the ram down to the ground and trampled upon it, and there was no one who could rescue the ram from its power. Then the male goat grew exceedingly great, but at the height of its power, the great horn was broken, and in its place there came up 4 prominent horns toward the 4 winds of heaven. And then we get to the part of the little horns. It's kind of all in this section, right? It's all little horn stuff here. So out of one of them came another horn, a little one, which grew exceedingly great toward the south, toward the east, and toward the beautiful land. It grew as high as the host of heaven. It threw down to the earth some of the hosts and some of the stars, and trampled on them. Even against the prince of the hosts, it acted arrogantly. It took the regular burnt offering away from him and overthrew the place of his sanctuary. Because of wickedness, the host was given over to it together with the regular burnt offering. It cast truth to the ground and kept prospering in what it did. Then I heard a holy one speaking, and another holy one said to the one that spoke, For how long is this vision concerning the regular burnt offering, the transgression that makes desolate, and the giving over of the sanctuary and host to be trampled? And he answered him, For 2,300 evenings and mornings. Then the sanctuary shall be restored to its rightful state. All right, so then it goes on to say that Daniel was unable to understand the vision, but the angel Gabriel, so now we have an angel given name, and Gabriel shows up, appears, and offers the interpretation. Before giving the interpretation, Gabriel says that this vision is for the time of the end. So that becomes a key line. It's going to be reused in this chapter. We're going to see it also in the book of Daniel as well. Gabriel gives the interpretation of the rain and the goats. So I will tell you, of all the visions, this interpretation is the most helpful. It's the most specific, and it really leaves us without much doubt, right? So it says, As for the ram that you saw with 2 horns, these are the kings of Media and Persia. Hey, what do you know? We're actually given place names. So that's very helpful, right? The male goat is the king of Greece. Hey, we have another place name. So we know very specifically the ram and the goat who they are, okay? And the great horn between its eyes is the first king. Now, that's great, right? As for the horn that is broken, in place of which 4 others rose, 4 kingdoms shall arise from his nation, but not with his power. So Gabriel gives the interpretation of the little horn. So again, notice how long this is, right? This is the main focus of this passage. The most time is spent here. At the end of their rule, when the transgressions have reached their full measure, a king of bold countenance shall arise, skilled in intrigue. He shall grow strong in power, shall cause fearful destruction, and shall succeed in what he does. He shall destroy the powerful and the people of the holy ones. By his cunning he shall make the sea prosper under his hand, and in his own mind he shall be great. Without warning he shall destroy many, and shall even rise up against the prince of princes. But he shall be broken, and not by human hands. So after giving the interpretation, Gabriel instructs Daniel to seal up the vision, for it refers to the many days from now. Okay. So some important notes. The first thing that we see, and there's just little things along the way that give us glimpses into the time of the writing of this. And the first thing that we see, and I won't spend a ton of time here, you can go back over this and look, is that the history, whenever we get history surrounding Babylon and media and all that kind of stuff, the history of the book of Daniel is always a little bit sketchy, right? Or a little bit shaky. But it also helps us to accurately date the writing of the book of Daniel, right? So this whole thing starts with the reference to Belshazzar. Okay, Daniel presents Belshazzar. In the book of Daniel, we're presented with Belshazzar being the son of Nebuchadnezzar and the last king of Babylon. In fact, neither are actually even true. The final king of Babylon was Nabonidus. Although Belshazzar is a real historical figure, we do have real documentation and meetings of not by any church of imagination. He did serve as a co-regent for a time while Nabonidus was away in Arabia. Nabonidus had returned from Arabia and was present at the Battle of Opis in 539. Cyrus the Great, Persian, won a great victory, which led to the fall of Babylon. So if you're interested, this is the order of the final kings of Babylon, Nebuchadnezzar, and then I'm not going to you can look at it and say it for you. I know I usually operate with the fear, the idea that if I'm going to say it like I know it, people will believe me. I'm not. All right, Belshazzar. So he's actually known from history to be the son of Nabonidus, and Nabonidus actually had no relation to Nebuchadnezzar. So he came to power through a political shift, not inheritance. So we can see here presence in the writer of these visions that there's kind of memory of Belshazzar character, a real character, as being the final king. Because if you go back to Daniel chapter 5 in the Tales, read about how he was the king when the whole writing on the wall happened, and then that's when the Persians showed up and everything fell, right? That in fact did not happen. Belshazzar and all that kind of stuff. So the other interesting part of this vision is that the setting is in and it appears what the vision is trying to do here, because it's talking about the clash between the Greeks and Persians, right? And it's saying that it happened in Susa. There was never really a battle at Susa, so this may not be a sticking point really, but it's really unsure why this vision is placed in Susa. Susa was one of the prominent capital cities in the Persian Empire, but there never was a battle there, so really never was a clash of Persia and Greece in this place. I think you can see a couple of like I here, those were big battles between Persia and Greece. Alexander, he was making his campaign. So, but it's just little things like this that remind us, when this thing's being written, and it helps identify that picture. Right? But anyway, as mentioned in the introduction, Daniel is the only vision. So this is an important thing over here. The only vision in chapter 7 to 12 that specific designations to some of the images of the vision. So for that purpose, it really helps us to be an interpretive key because there's language that is used in this vision that, and actually there are different views as we talked about as to how to interpret and how to understand the kingdoms and all that kind of stuff. But basically, everyone agrees on any side of whatever aisle that this little horn is antagonist for in this chapter. We really disagree. So for the most part. And so that then helps us to understand, going back to chapter 7, who the little horn is, right? And the descriptions of the male goats, how it's so strong, exceedingly strong, and all this kind of stuff, and how it just demolishes and terrorizes. It's obviously, links back to that fourth beast in the meaning before. And there's other terminology like the abomination and desolates, all this sort of stuff is brought up here in this chapter, and that's going to be used a few times in the future. So it helps us as an interpretive key to the rest of the book in a lot of ways about what's being. Okay, so the next page, as usual, I just have the breakdown as for what's being said for as far as the vision and the interpretation. We can actually just skip on to the next page because I've run through all of that, so you get the idea of what these little charts are helping you with for now. So let's just go through. We'll just start breaking this down. So the first horn, that's identified in the dream by Gabriel as medium. So we have no doubt about that. There's no argument there. So it said that it came up first and it was short. So that's the description of this. So basically, we have this ram with two horns, and there was a first horn, which is Media, all right, and it had a second horn, which is identified as Persia. So the second horn again came up later, and it was longer, so meaning it's bigger and stronger and more powerful than the first one. And probably the reason for putting these together on the same animal is because, as we've talked about, the progression of kingdoms being Babylon, Media, Persia, Greece, and showed all the different ways that's how Daniel operates in that progression. But at the same time, they're the same animal because Cyrus, being the first king of Persia, he was descended by both a Mede and a Persian, and he brought the people together to unify the people. But again, it kind of comes down to he beat them up and made them obey. But he brought them together as one people groups, and for a time they were seen as one. And then we have, and this is described, the description given to this ram is that it charged westward, northward, and southward. All right, so this makes sense because anybody still have their week one handouts with them with the maps? If you want to look at a map, you can start looking at those maps now. So I usually don't have mine in front of me, but so any one of those maps you can probably see. Just look at one of them, maybe the one that's referring to the Persian Empire or whatever. So here we go. See, John was prepared. Something was prepared. So let's see. Where does it show here? Hey, that's actually not the one that's really the easiest to read. Go to the one that's Alexander's Empire. That on the top map there, or the second to last page, or last page. All right, so you can see where Judea is in that map. Okay, so and then if you look to the east, you see where Babylonia is. Okay, it's across the Arabian Desert. All right, and then below that, and even further east, is where Persia originated from. All right, so when this is described as going westward, from the west, you can see that. So all of this is being described from the perspective of Jerusalem, right? So it's being written as the perspective of Jerusalem. So Persia comes from the west, they turn westward, right? They go northward because Asia Minor, which is up where like Lydia is, north of Syria, that that peninsula, it's modern day Turkey. Persia took control of most of that. That's that's the northern part, and then the southward part would be Egypt. You can see where Egypt is, south of Judea, south of Jerusalem. That's so that just refers to the spread of the Persian, right? So then we have the male goats, which is specifically identified as Greece by the interpreter, by Israel. And it says they appeared from the west. You can see where Macedonia is. It doesn't say Greece, so all the way on the left of the map there, you see Macedonia. That's just kind of northern of modern day Greece. As where Macedonia, that's where Alexander originated from, Macedon. So they came from the west, right? It says, this is a really cool line. It says they came across the face of the whole earth without touching the ground. So, right, that's just an image of how fast they happened. You talk about that. Alexander, in like a 10-year period, basically conquered the empire, right? Absolutely incredible. Fast, like quick that happened. So, the image you described is, across the whole earth without even touching the ground. So that goat had a horn between its eyes, one single horn. The interpretation tells us that's the king. It's described later as the great horn, right? So this is Alexander the Great. And the goat threw down the ram. And that can be described in some detail, the overwhelming defeat of the Persians by Alexander the Great. And if you really get into depth and read about what Alexander did and how he did it, it's pretty intense. So the intensity that's kind of reflected here. So in its place, there came up four prominent horns. So we've talked about this in previous weeks. So actually, Josh, we talked about that in previous weeks about how Alexander died and his kingdom split, right, into four different sections. So that's what's being referred to here. And I just have four different kingdoms that arose out of his. So all this was lining perfectly together in the sort of what happened. And it also says, but not with his power, right? So the kingdom was never as strong as it was under Alexander. Right. So then we get to the little horn. So again, we get to that main part, or the main villain, if you will. Not the main part, but it's definitely the main villain. So this section received the most attention by Daniel. Again, this is because it addresses the original writer's immediate situation. Right? This is what's going on with that. So, and it's actually very interesting because at one point, as the vision's being described, right, you have all these images that go right the horn, the little horn, all this stuff, all these big images begin. At one point, the images just kind of stop. And in verses 11 and 12, we're just straight up read what he's doing in real time. Like it just kind of turns into this intense, like this is what he's doing. It's forget that whole kind of being element of it now. This is what he's doing. So it gets pretty intense. And again, this is something I have read about in commentaries, and all this kind of stuff. The I don't say the Greek, the Hebrew. So I don't do that Greek stuff. No. The Hebrew of when it gets to the little horn actually gets very erratic. And there's a lot of debate about what's up with that, why exactly. But the common belief is probably the Hebrew gets very erratic and it's almost poorly written. And it's probably to just intensify, it's a literary device to intensify how dire it is and how the intensity of desperation in this moment, right? And what's going on with this moment. So anyway, so it says he grew exceedingly great toward the south, toward the east, and toward the beautiful land. All right, so south, by the time of Antiochus IV's reign, the Seleucids had gained control of Egypt. Right, that's south of Jerusalem. The eastern lands that had been lost by the Seleucid kingdom were being regained. So if you remember back from our history lesson back in week 1, the Seleucid kingdom over a period of decades was losing a lot of ground. And then Antiochus IV's father, Antiochus III, was a very powerful and effective king, and he regained a lot of the land. So by the time Antiochus IV comes along, they have more land than they used to. But also remember that Antiochus III also lost that really bad battle to so there's a lot of strain at the same time. But this is the key part right here. It says he grew toward the beautiful land. So this is going to be referring to Jerusalem. We get to chapter 11, it's used again, beautiful land, right? So chapter 11, verse 15, this is a term that's about Jerusalem. So the little border goes great towards the south, towards the east, and towards the beautiful land, towards Jerusalem. So it says he grew as high as the hosts of heaven. Talk about this already. Antiochus IV thinking himself, oh, thank God. This is also likely in reference to the passage in Isaiah, which is speaking about the arrogance of the Babylonian king. So there's language in the book of Isaiah talking about the Babylonian king. So listen to the similarities here from Isaiah 14. It said, you said in your heart, I will ascend to heaven. I will raise my throne above the stars of God. I will ascend to the tops of the clouds. I will make myself like the Most High. So we have very similar language here. Then it says that he threw down to the earth some of the posts and some of the stars and trampled on them. In ancient literature, stars are often personified when speaking about deity warfare. This is likely referring to the killing of many Jews. Gabriel explains it like this: he shall destroy the powerful and the people of the holy ones. So that's the interpretation part. He shall destroy the powerful and the people of the holy ones. So it says, even against the prince of the host, it acted arrogantly. So that prince of the host, who is that? And there's actually different interpretations about that. Some say it's talking about the high priest, but most commentators agree, most people agree it's talking about God. Even arrogant, it's God himself. That's a big no-no. Just a doctrine without occasional water. Because there's an occasion. All right, so, and then this is the part where it gets very specific, where the imagery is kind of dropped. Talking about stars and hosts and all this kind of stuff anymore, right? It actually gets very specific about what this little horn is doing, right? It says that it took the regular burnt offering away. You know, that's something that he did. Overthrew the place of the sanctuary, right? Because of wickedness, host was given over to. It cast truth to the ground. It kept prospering in what it did. So we actually have very specific earthly examples here, right? Of the burnt offering being thrown away. We're thrown in place in the sanctuary. All of this happened. But it ends with this line in the interpretation part where it says, but he shall be broken and not by human hands. That's actually a very interesting line because, well, number one, Antiochus IV in 164 does actually die of an illness, right? So he was broken, not by human hands, right? So that actually does happen. But there's a lot of assumption about maybe this might even be a jab at the Maccabean revolt. And so we've talked about this at 167 BC when the little horn, where it did all these things, destroyed the sanctuary, all this kind of stuff, that there was a revolt led by the Maccabean people, right? And the nickname Maccabees. And so a lot of people joined that fighting. And it got so intense they even made a decision to fight on the Sabbath. Right? Like it was to that extreme. So you can read about that in the book of First Maccabees, which is a very fascinating read. But then we also know that there was a sect of Judaism later which activated for more of a passive approach, right? Going back to what I talked about a few weeks ago, Jeremiah's approach, Babylon's coming and taking it, right? Jeremiah said, it's happening. You just have to let it happen. But don't worry, God will take care of it in the end, right? And that's the book of Daniel, right? That's the message of the book of Daniel. Like, it's happening, it's bad, but God will take care of it, right? Trust God. So some see this possibly as a little jab saying to the people who are revolting, the Maccabees, saying, you know, this isn't going to happen by human hands. So, not sure about that, but it's an interesting thought right there. Then we come to the crux of the issue. right? This kind of really is the crux in this moment. Is at the end of the vision, Daniel overhears these two heavenly beings talking to one another, and one asks the most important question: how long is this going to go on? The sanctuary is destroyed. Burnt offerings have ceased. People are being killed. The city is overrun. Life is ending as we know it. How long? And so you can just hear the people through that question. They'd be asking that question. How long? When we get to the next vision in Daniel chapter 9, it's a similar question that's going to be asked in that. But if you're in the middle of that, isn't that your question? Right? How much longer? How long is this going to happen? So the answer is, actually, in that question is where we have a very key phrase that is going to show up a total of 4 times throughout the book of Daniel. In that question, it says, how long the transgression that makes desolate, right? Or, and later it's referred to the abomination that makes desolate, right? The abomination, desolation, in your translation. How long is that going to be going on to? So remember that phrase, in the service. We'll talk more about that shortly. So the answer is given for 2,300 evenings and mornings. Okay? So probably what we're doing here is probably what most people say you got to half that number because every day includes what? An evening and a morning, right? So if you have 2,300 evenings and mornings, you probably have 1,000 days. And that is very close, not exactly very close to that 3.5 year period, right? So again, it's probably just another way of presenting that 3.5 concept, I think, right? That's bottom in chapter 7. So we talked about the significance of 3.5 years. All right, so before we end, and that's right up against the time here, but I do just want to get through this. So page left. All right, so spend a little time here talking about this phrase, the transgression or the abomination that desolates. So a key moment, as we've talked about multiple times in this class, in Jewish history, is when Antiochus IV overtook Jerusalem, desecrated the altar of burnt offering by setting up an altar to Zeus. Chapter 8 clearly refers to this moment. And there have been attempts been made to force the references in this event to this event. It's also referenced in other parts, 19:6, 11:31, 12:11, to refer to an event in our future which has yet to occur. But that would probably disregard, in my understanding, this would disregard the present crisis that each of these visions are addressing in Daniel. So this book of Daniel is a very immediate thing, right? It's addressing an immediate situation, something that people are going through. And this event is happening right in front of them. That's really important. So the main reason people kind of lean towards the idea that this abomination that desolates refers to something in our future is that Jesus actually alludes to this verse in Matthew chapter 24. Also in Matthew 13 and Luke 21. There's accounts of that. So I have the clip from Mark for here. They all basically say the same thing. But one in Mark says this, but when you see the desolating sacrilege set up where it ought not to be, and then we have a parenthetical statement that says, let the reader understand. So that's kind of the author's way of saying, like, there's more going on here than simply what's being said. Think about this, right? Get your brain wheels, get the hamster running inside, right? Feed that hamster. So he's saying, so when you see, this is Jesus telling his followers, when you see the desolating sacrilege set up where it ought not to be, let the reader understand that those in Judea must flee to the mountains. When it's mentioned in Matthew, he actually physically mentions Daniel, right? Daniel actually comes up in that statement. Particularly Matthew, Mark, Luke, they all say it pretty much in the same way. So what's Jesus doing in referencing it? So in these passages, Jesus' reference to Daniel is a warning that similar thing will happen in their near future, right? In AD 70, we have the Romans that lay siege to eventually overthrow Jerusalem. ruling the temple. And if you read the history of what happened with the Romans in Jerusalem in AD 70, it's in a lot of ways pretty eerily similar to what happened with Antiochus IV. So it's very right, it's very correct with Jesus. Of course, everything Jesus does is correct. I didn't say Jesus, I heard the message. I can't. So, of course, Jesus is right. But, when he's alluding to Daniel and he says, "Oh, let the reader understand," right? Like, you've seen this before, you're going to see it again. And so, when the horrific nature of the events of under Antiochus, what Daniel's dealing with, it's going to be that, right? And when you see it, Jesus is saying, "Run," right? Like, it's bad, right? Jesus says, "Run." I'm running. It's that T-shirt that says, "I'm a bomb technician. If I'm running, try and keep up." Jesus said, "Run, try and keep up," right? So anyway, so I want to close with this, and we're going to spend. I briefly introduced that idea, so I know I breezed through that a little bit. There's more to come on that. So hang in there, 'cause that's important. Concept. But I just wanted to make sure that that gets introduced. Like I said, chapter 8 is a really helpful as an interpretive key because it hits the things that come in visions before and after to help us truly understand what's being talked about. But I want to leave you with this today because I think this is really powerful reading right here. So the book of First Maccabees. Anybody ever read any of First Maccabees or come across it? So First Maccabees was written in the second century, right around the time all this is going on, after it actually, and it's the documentation of all this. So it's actually included in some Bibles. The Catholic Bible will actually have this as part of the Bible, Protestant Bible. But you can see it as part of the Apocrypha. So if you pick up a Bible, the Apocrypha, or most Bible apps, if you use the right translation, whatever, you'll probably find it in there. So it's very accessible. You can find it. It's a very fascinating read. So I don't consider it scripture, of course, but it's very helpful to understand what was going on. It gives you all the history behind it, right? So the book of First Maccabees recorded Antiochus IV's destruction, and it used the same language, desolation, in reference to what was done to the altar. Reading this account can help us feel the horror the Jews felt and how helpful the words of Daniel must have been. It is a timeless word to people who find themselves in hard situations. Jesus utilized the message of Daniel to warn and reassure his generation. So those of us today who find ourselves in desperate situations can also lean upon Daniel's powerful words of promise. No matter how dire things get, God is still all powerful and will come through for his people. So I want to close by reading this section in First Maccabees 2. And this is the description of what Antiochus did. And so it really helps to put into perspective what I've been talking about. It says, "Then the king," this is Antiochus talking about, "wrote to his whole kingdom that all should be one people." So in other words, he means Hellenized people, forced from Greek culture, and that all should give up their particular customs. All the Gentiles accepted the command of the king. Many, even from Israel, gladly adopted his religion. They sacrificed to idols and profaned the Sabbath. And the king sent letters by messengers to Jerusalem and the towns of Judah. He directed them to follow customs strange to the land, to forbid burnt offerings and sacrifices and drink offerings in the sanctuary, to profane the Sabbath, to profane Sabbaths and festivals, to defile the sanctuary and the priests, to build altars and sacred precincts and shrines for idols, to sacrifice swine and other clean animals, and to leave their sons uncircumcised. They were to make themselves abominable by everything unclean and profane, so that they would forget the law and change all ordinances. He added, "And whoever does not obey the command of the king shall die." In such words he wrote to his whole kingdom. He appointed inspectors over all the people and commanded the towns of Judah to offer sacrifice, town by town. Many of the people, everyone who forsook the law, joined them, and they did evil in the land. They drove Israel into hiding in every place of refuge they had. Now, on the 15th day of Chislev, in the 145th year, they erected a desolating sacrifice altar of offering. They also built altars in the surrounding towns of Judah and offered incense at the doors to the houses and in the streets. The books of the law that they found tore to pieces and burned with fire. Anyone found possessing the book of the covenant, or anyone who adhered to the law, was condemned to death by decree of the king. They kept using violence against Israel, against those who were found month after month in the towns. On the 25th day of the month, they offered sacrifice on the altar that was the top of the altar and burnt off. According to the decree, they put to death the women who had their children circumcised, and their families, and those who circumcised them, and they hung the infants from their mothers' necks. But many in Israel stood firm and were resolved in their hearts not to eat unclean food. They chose to die rather than be defiled by food or to profane the holy covenant, and they did die. Very great wrath came upon Israel. So that came from First Maccabees, and I have also referenced there First Maccabees 4, which is what it records that they reclaimed the temple, and you can read about the rededication of it and all that kind of stuff. So I don't know that any of us who have grown up and lived our entire lives here in America can truly grasp what it would be to live in a situation like this. Every once in a while, like a good idea, you pull this out and read about it if you're having a bad day, and all of a sudden your day's not that bad. But that being said, it's such an incredible reminder that the words to these people are God is still there. Such an important word, such a powerful, and it's the powerful it's the powerful word of David that is trying to get across. That beautiful, inspiring word to his people, and it's a message that holds true from generation to generation. So I don't know. I just want to close and thank God for who He is. Thank you guys for being here. But let's pray. Lord, I thank you so much that throughout history and even today, your people, their lives are threatened, but your people are still here. We're living proof of that. Millions and millions and millions of people around the world stand up and look to you every single day. And God, I just thank you for your faithfulness. I thank you that you're ever present. And I thank you that no matter how difficult life gets, you're still there. The ancient one who's unchanging, who will be there forever and ever. We just thank you that we have this foundation no matter what. And we take that with us as we head out this evening. We just pray this all in your amazing name. In the name of Jesus, amen. All right, well, I love you guys so much. Thank you for being here tonight. I'll see you again next time. Have a good night.